nhà rong giúp mình mở cho số lên cho tưởng đã nói của gia hóa này cả rong xe đã tạo tên trí này rồi sở hóa sở cho nó cứ nào mà vậy nếu mà chán tên thì cái nó của gia ta là của sở thế cứ vào hai tiền em rong ra đánh nên nó này nhiều lỡ mà kia là dễ thế ra đánh nên là cái mốt sau cháu bị đầu từ viên giàu Aashly Maiv Paj Santiago tuần này là tuần ý nhớ thầu cái video học cá nhưng rong ta là thọ cái này sẽ là chỉ cái là cái như rong
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers. You love, you love, you love. I don't wanna meet your mother. Never ever ask me how I've been. Remember why you have my number. You love, you love, you love. I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you. Here's your time to shine. Now show me what you can do. My hands feel on your body. The way we're dancing in the dark. With every move I make, you're falling.
Maiv Paj's face paled, and she took several steps backward, as the grandfather laughed and playfully slapped Landon's shoulders. Ôi, mi tú, cháu hay lý có trả mìnhဆိုင်trai mà. Cháu là mình sai, bé tôi sai cân nhật có gì sữa. She didn't know how to respond, and she stood where she was as he looked up at her with those dark eyes of his. Mình sai, là mất được cái nó chẳng à, Maiv Paj's mother said. She walked over to where the chicken lay, where her mother had been washing it earlier. They continued talking quietly, and Maiv Paj took the chance to look at Landon. From this light, he actually was really quite handsome. His hair was longer than most men that she knew, and he was very well built. His arms were bigger and more muscular, and he was taller than most of the men in the village. He was, in reality, one of the most dashing men she'd ever seen in her life. He turned, and their eyes caught. She jerked with fear and moved too fast, where when trying to maintain posture, her hand accidentally grabbed the knife beside her, and it slit her finger. She gasped and dropped the chicken to the ground, making a loud clatter. Maiv Paj, her mother shouted. As she reached down to pick up the chicken, a pair of hands picked it up for her and set it inside the bowl, and then he caught sight of her bleeding finger. Po, go Maiv Paj, he said as he took her hand and led her out of the house. When they were out of earshot, she turned to face him as he looked around. Ne, tu cái đây nhớ là khó tử? He asked. She frowned, confused. Bé tu cái đây? He groaned. Yeah, your hose, where is it? When he realized he was speaking English, he cleared his throat and said, ne she đi cả. Maiv Paj pointing to the barrel of water around the corner of the house. Bé lu thông đây nhớ tỏ. He took her over and took the small bowl left in there to use. He took a bowl full of water and then looked at her. Your mom? He took that moment to stick her hand into the bowl, and that had Maiv Paj yelping. Wow, she cried as she took the finger and began sucking it. Maiv Paj tasted the tanging blood that circulated in her mouth as he watched her. Whoa, he asked. Maiv Paj removed her finger and cried, Hachima, he laughed. Wow, Maiv Paj stopped and blinked. He came forward and she began backing up. Maiv Paj didn't understand as he cornered her into the wall. He brought his hands around to block her in as she looked up into his dark eyes. He was really so handsome. And then he leaned down close to her until they were eye to eye. She felt her breath quicken as he lowered his face to hers. He whispered. Maiv Paj didn't trust her voice. Actually, it was gone altogether. She felt her heart flutter, and she swallowed down the lump in her throat. She didn't know how to answer. She shifted and turned her face sideways. "Za," she ordered. He laughed. "Za lo?" "Yeah, za gay," she cried. Smiling, he replied, "Yo kume." Maiv Paj frowned as he continued smiling. Anger filled her, and she stomped on his foot. "Whoa!" He yelled and moved quickly, jumping up and down. Laughing, she hurried back inside the house.
Your face in the crowd, I never thought that I would see it tonight. We lock eyes and you smile. Every single memory comes back to life. Your lips pressed against mine. got drunk and ended up at your place. From the moment that I saw you, I knew that it was love, bet that you felt the same. Standing here, I need to let you know, what if I had never let you go?
The evening sun was setting, and the atmosphere outside was getting colder as my pa's father began poking the fire to make it bigger. Around him were the guests who were getting ready for bed. After dinner, she'd had the hardest time trying to concentrate because all she thought about was what Landon had threatened her. She didn't even know the guy, yet somehow the way he acted was quite intoxicating to her. And yeah, he was a handsome devil, which didn't help either. The worst was that he was going to be sleeping right outside her door. Her father and the grandfather were chatting quietly about growing up in America. Her mother brought out the blankets and handed them to her. "Mày ba, có muốn khó lúc ra khỏi ít biết sẽ đừng gần đi kể thế lý tao sợ." "Oh, Leon, yeah." "Mày đâu? Muốn ba mình xài mày ba?" the grandmother ordered. It wasn't open for discussion, and she stood while he followed her to where the guest's bed lay. When she took the pillow and laid it on the bed, he reached for the blanket and set it down. She couldn't look at him. Being so near him like this was making her heart feel strange things she didn't like, things she was against. "Bây giờ trở lại có lúc anh dâu là con chưa tao là nè. Chỉ có hai tia của những mất cái đầu xì này con trai của nó lỏng cậu," he asked. My pa turned and glared at him. "Cú luôn bể chỉ lỏng cậu nè." He smiled. "Oh, ấy giờ bao lâu nó đó?" "Jay-moi!" she cried before she could stop herself. And, too late, everyone else heard it too. She dropped her hands as her mother turned and gave her a warning gaze. Landon laughed and crossed his arms. "Nè nè, chỉ nênว่าเช็คอีกเก่งๆ don't hit the mừng cho the king sir." "Tì con ta." He pointed a finger to himself. "Cú, sao mà lúc gì đó cú tiò? Sẽ nên tiền tụi kiến thứ sư mà, sẽ rồi nó có ta là nè." She ran a hand through her hair and walked around him just as he whispered a long go. She ignored him as she walked into her room and put the mosquito net down around her bed. It was around midnight when Landon heard the whispering coming from where my pa was sleeping. He'd heard of men coming to court women by the side of the house from his grandfather, but tonight he was actually really experiencing it. Knowing who she was going to be to him, he was going to make himself present during the courtship of other men. He carefully removed the net and slipped out. He slowly walked to where she lay and heard her talking. "Jay-moi, mu chế đâu có được bận nhở? You được bận nhở? Mua tép lá mình nhỏ ai phê tôi đã chỉ tao tên nào nè," she said. Landon frowned and realized the man outside her wall was not particularly welcomed, but he listened and heard the man outside reply, "Long go, sao sẽ phải phải trái bia kê, bị chỉ yo go này yo chế có bớt gì." So that was why she didn't like him calling her Long go. "Kia mu chế nan chứ mua? Oh, chỉ kia liao, yun đâu có nhớ tới có im mà." Frustrated, she turned over in her bed. Landon walked over and opened the net, causing her to quietly yelp. The man outside asked, "Long go, she gave London a glare, and in the moon's ray he smiled at her. He put a hand over her mouth and joined her in bed. There was some movement, and the man outside replied, Landon took that as his opportunity, and he answered, He heard her small gasp, and then the man outside went quiet for long moments before he started speaking again. "Wow, long go. Landon smiled as she gave him a death glare. After a moment, they heard him leave, and my pa tore his hand off of her mouth and shoved him away. She cried. He grabbed her wrists together and leaned down to her. Before she could speak, he took her lips and gave her a deep, hard kiss. He felt her body tremble beneath him, and when he finished, she lay still, frozen in place. He laughed at her reaction. "He threatened. He watched as she turned away and remained silent. He smiled and bent down to peck her cheek. sweetie.
Would you stay till the morning light? Or would you follow me? Or would you let it be? If I leave tonight, we could do this right. We'll find the remedy. Or would you stay with me now till the morning light? Before you turn away, I just want you to know that I didn't throw your stuff away. Before you make up your mind that I'm nowhere to find, I'm standing right here.
Maiv grabbed her bamboo basket and had just swung it over her back when Landon came through the door with a smile on his face. She thought of how his lips felt against hers last night. She felt her stomach do flips. She ignored him and gathered her things. She walked toward Paku's house and saw her mother feeding the chickens. Her mother was a short and gentle woman with caring brown eyes. She was an orphan whose adoptive parents sold her to pay for debts, and Paku's father bought her to be his wife. The story itself made Maiv Paj feel so much love. Pao, Paku po nhớ trẻ lo? She asked. True looked up and smiled. Có to là mình sai. Tại khi nói Paku tôi muốn tay tật tay lo. Nữ hai tia trả nên mất coi chỉ trong tác cậu này nữ ôn tay là nữ muốn thầu tư là nè. Nữ nó có mua kia nó sao? Giờ có chỉ chẳng kể tới rồi có chẳng dân nữa thì nữ này mới chỉ cần xía nè. Maiv Paj turned and walked toward the path to Paku's garden, and the walk turned into a run, and as her mother said, Paku was just walking ahead swinging her arms. Maiv Paj smiled and yelled for her friend. Paku, to quá, she cried. She began running to her, and Paku turned around as Maiv Paj met up with her. Ôi chà, cái to của Lina, cái gì to cái lợ. Ồ, có muốn tôi nhớ tờ trẻ nè, của thế li mua của mà. Bây giờ li của hai nó. Before Maiv Paj could answer, the sound of Thai's voice came loudly up from the hill. Phong was walking beside him as the two came down, and Maiv Paj groaned, frustrated with them. It looked like they had been fishing, since their pant legs were rolled up halfway up their calves. They didn't carry anything, though, except a bow and arrow in hand. Long cậu, cụ đi xa thì có ấy từ long cậu xứ nọ. Nhờ cụ bảo thì ai có chuyện nên nó có bùi用nhiệm bỏ có mà. Cụ thứ kia cụ thứ khương một thân tư nọ, Phong said. Maiv Paj rolled her eyes as Paku looked at her with confusion. Chị mua, cái chị một trẻ à, giả đếm gì là cô. Phong came forward and grabbed her arm. She tried to yank free as Paku pushed him, but Thai grabbed both of Paku's arms. Maiv Paj's scream was heard as Phong began dragging her toward the bushes. Cái sao ô xuân trai của mà, Phong said. Cho của nà, cái chỉ cho của ít thế cái gì mà nà, Maiv Paj cried. Maiv Paj! All looked toward the voice that spoke, and Maiv Paj's heart lifted as she saw Landon standing there, dressed in monk clothes carrying an axe over his shoulder. Maiv Paj ripped her arms free and grabbed Paku's hand from Thai as the two friends ran over to where Landon stood. Phong and Thai came together and walked toward where Landon stood, their faces broken in anger. Kapoja, Landon asked as Maiv Paj reached him. She shook her head. He stepped forward as the other two came closer to him. Có gì lần tư? Phong asked. Landon smiled. Oh, có gì tụi nó mai lần xin là tao chạy bây giờ. Phong crossed his arms. Giờ thì á, ấy có gì lần tư nào? Landon grinned and pulled Maiv Paj to stand beside him. Cô yêu tụi nó Maiv Paj bưng hột sai mò nà. Paku gasped loudly, and Maiv Paj turned to shush her up as Phong's face broke into hate. Cô thích tao bỏ có đôi. Cô nhớ có thứ to nào? Thai asked as Phong tried to collect his emotions together. Cô là, cô to đã lâu to nà. Cô to mì cả to là? Phong asked. Ôi chà có to chân thử nào nọ. Cô to cho cô to nè mù chạy sư tia. The two men looked at Maiv Paj, whose face had turned white, but they turned their attention back to Landon. Cô đã bỏ. Chỉ nên nhớ ý giả lời chỉ đã liệu. Giờ sắp bảo tia kì, mà nó to nó gai sơ mà. Thai and Phong looked at each other and then walked around them and off. Once they disappeared from view, Maiv Paj tore the arm that Landon was holding and went to Paku. Paku, lỡ mùa, she said. Ta cho, Landon said. Nếu như mua đã chị. Paku replied, Ui mua tay sao? Ấy có to đã chị nọ. He moved his eyes to where Maiv Paj was standing and looked at her for a split second before he returned his gaze to Paku. Cứ tuân thìa Maiv Paj, kia của nế lùa. Nếu một sơ tờ tế của mà lên một giật tờ. Ô lê là tao má, Paku said.
I wanna be a weekend lover. Yeah, I'ma be the best damn lover you got. I wanna mess up your covers. You love, you love, you love. I don't wanna meet your mother. Never ever ask me how I've been. Remember while you have my number.
tôi hãy con nè, Baku whispered, as the two were standing in the rice field cutting the stalks. My pa didn't know how to feel as she stood there holding the stalks in her hand, trying to feel them, but not feeling anything. Her hands had gone numb. The wind had died and it was hot. The sweat was running down her back and she felt faint. She remembered she hadn't eaten breakfast, and last night during dinner she'd been so angry of everything that she'd gone to bed eating very little. My pa said. Baku turned her back and continued talking. When my pa didn't reply, Baku turned to find her friend already on the ground, unconscious. Landon watched as my pa stirred, and her eyes fluttered open. She was laying on the ground of the garden shed. He was watching the stove that Baku had boiled food in before she left. He pushed up the sleeves of his shirt as she sat up and brushed her hair away from her face. She looked so fragile sitting there, and he felt sorry for her. Bakurutula, she asked without looking at him. He cleared his throat and replied, Numuhuka netola, the yakachi nai unchachagoda. Guichi talama. Jonka. Kapachapla. Chi chai. But at the same time she answered, her stomach growled loudly. Landon laughed as she turned away, embarrassed. He took a bowl from beside him and filled it with the soup. He got up and walked over to where she sat and knelt down beside her. He handed it to her, and she didn't take it. Sweetie, she shot her head up. She took it and began eating. He returned to where he sat and made himself a bowl to eat. He noticed her eyes on him, but he ignored it and slurped loudly. He murmured his appreciation loudly. Good night, she don't jit all again, my pa yelled. He smiled and looked up at her. Oh, the chiakua. Her eyes darkened as the sound of feet walking came upon them. Baku walked in with her mother trailing behind them, and his grandmother. They looked from one to the other as Landon helped his grandmother to sit down. He asked gently. And then she turned her attention to my pa. Before she could respond, Landon answered, My pa didn't know how to answer, and his grandmother laughed, hitting him playfully on the arm. Got you, Landon. Landon smiled as his grandmother gave him a peck on the cheek. My pa said. Minsai, my pa's mother said as she took out some herbs. Landon smiled and then turned to look at Baku. As he said that, the girl turned bright red and looked at him and then at my pa in confusion. She just chuckled and muttered a soft "law" as my pa took the herb her mother instructed, and he smiled. This might be just fun, messing around with her, knowing she was going to be his, and her not knowing a single thing.
Would you stay till the morning light? Or would you follow me? Or would you let it be? If I leave tonight, we could do this right. We'll find the remedy. Or would you stay with me now till the